You are listening to AccessUW, a podcast series brought to you by the University of Washington Office of the ADA Coordinator, where we highlight insightful discussions, informative interviews, and valuable insights about accessibility, equity, and inclusion, all within the realm of higher education with experts across the UW. In terms of accessibility, each podcast and a transcript are made available at the Office of the ADA Coordinator's website at www.washington.edu/ADA. Welcome back to season 2 of the AccessUW podcast. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about service animals, especially as the University of Washington just recently updated our service animal policy in fall 2024. Today, we have our lovely ADA coordinator with us, Bree Callahan, here to tell us a little bit more about the policy changes and just give us a brief overview of the service animal policy, making sure that we understand the rights and responsibilities associated with this important access need for some individuals. Bree, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here to talk about a very important topic.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's just dive right into it. Bree, could you first define for us what are service animals? How are these different than maybe a pet or maybe a work animal? How are these different?
No, great starting point. So a service animal does have a legally defined definition, which is in our state policy, federal policy, and then so those all connect to our UW policy. So that definition means that any dog or miniature horse that is individually trained to do work or perform a task for an individual with a disability. So that's the basic definition there. There's been evolution over time in terms of how that's evolved in the state of Washington definition, but a dog or miniature horse that provides a task or does work. So where that line is different, these are active tasks, and they are very clearly something that is done for a person with disability, because that there is not the ability to do that effectively for themselves. So an example could be a diabetic service alert animal who is getting medication, going to fetch it and bring it back, or to indicate to the individual, like whether they put a paw or do some sort of pressure application to remind somebody to take medication. So those are actual active tasks that they actually are doing to support the individual's navigation of that disability or needs to address it.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. And before we go into more so of the specificity of this policy specifically and some of the other definitions that are included under this, can you kind of just reiterate the importance of service animals in the context of accessibility and in the context of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Absolutely. So at a core, this is about access. All these regulations are about access. And at the university, that's about access to a lot of programs, services, and activities that we deliver for our community internally and externally. So a service animal is an access tool for a person with a disability. And I'll use the kind of another example of a wheelchair or other mobility devices, whether that's a cane or a scooter or other kinds of things. These are the devices that help provide access to our spaces. So a service animal is a similar thing. There are many, many ways people navigate our environments, and service animals can help with that. They can help open doors. They can help provide balance for individuals who need that navigating our physical spaces. They can alert them, as I mentioned in my example about the diabetic service animal, when they need to take medication or be aware of an environment. There's a psychiatric service animals. You might be aware of things that have been in the veterans community, where there's to alert people where they are in rooms or if people are coming towards them. There's many ways that we need access support throughout our environment. So this is just one tool, and that is critical to make sure we are creating spaces where people can fully engage and have meaningful access across our programs and services.
Thank you. Those examples are really helpful. And one question I get asked frequently as well too is the conflation between emotional support animals and service animals. And I know both of them are outlined in terms of definitions and where they're allowed in this policy. Could you give us a high level overview of how emotional support animals or ESAs are different than service animals?
Yeah, the biggest difference is in the active versus passive support that they are providing. So my example earlier that I'll add on to, the active task is something that is direct and is where the person with or the individual with a disability is not able to perform that task, either in a temporary situation or in a permanent situation. So that is the actively taking the medication bottle right from the shelf and bringing it to somebody, because in that moment that person cannot actually do that work, but they need to take the medication. Perhaps there's a something happening for the individual with disability and they need to lean on to the animal, and that use of the animal is that kind of support, structural support when they're walking around. That's an active task that is needed in supports. The passive task, it's not even a task, more passive support, I should say. So passive support versus an active task is where the emotional support animal comes into play. And that you can really look at the wording of emotional support. That is a passive, I feel more comforted or able to navigate a space where I can calm down. There's more of that emotional passive support versus an actual task performed. There's a fine line, for example, in that where there are service animals who, if somebody's going through a panic attack, they actually can provide pressure on certain points that are defined on a body that can actually help somebody out of a panic attack, or at least get them to cue into following a set of things to do to reduce their anxiety. And that's designed in their with their healthcare providers. But that actual pause on the body, like with like acupressure type of um, uh, application, that is a task versus just the comfort feeling that one might have by an animal maybe sitting on a lap or being next to them or being able to pet somebody. So that I hope that helps provide a little more detail.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it seems here that service animals are specifically trained to perform a task, whereas emotional support animals aren't necessarily trained for any types of tasks, but they do just provide this passive comfort or this emotional support, which can alleviate one of or more of the effects of a disability.
Yes, that's a great um, summary of that one. Absolutely.
Great. Okay, so now that we kind of understand the camps of service animals, emotional support animals, what is up with this policy update that happened at the Washington State Legislature, and why did the university update the policy? Can you provide us with a couple of highlights of what is now in the new UW service animal policy?
Absolutely. So the reason we updated the policy at the institution is because of a state law change. So that was the driving factor behind the need to update our policy. So, which is typical for any time there's a new code or regulation or law change. We have to make sure our university policies are in alignment to our either city, county, state, or federal requirements. So that prompted the reason to update. Specifically, what changed in the state law was broadening access abilities and requirements for service animals in training. So historically, service animals in training did not have certain access rights that service animals have had for years. So that's the main shift in the state law that we can get into. But we at the University of Washington had been getting feedback about aspects of our service animal policy that wasn't in place before. So we also took the chance to update and provide more clarity and better information to provide guidance to the university community related to handlers' responsibilities, when an animal can be removed, and there were some definitions that we wanted to update because the language had changed over the last 5 years.
Great. That's really helpful, Bree. So it seems like there's three different definitions that are protected or at least have some types of rights and responsibilities under this new policy. We have service animals, which you've already defined, service animals in training, which are just service animals that are undergoing training to be able to perform these tasks, active work tasks to support an individual with a disability, and emotional support animals. So all three of these animals, correct me if I'm wrong, all three of these animals, they're handlers. So one individual with a disability that has a service animal, or an individual that an emotional support animal assists, they all have different responsibilities they need to meet when they have these animals on campus. Could you highlight some of the responsibilities that handlers are required to follow?
Absolutely. This is a really important component because in this policy, that was one of the clarifications that we did to make sure that we updated our definitions to match all of the regulatory pieces, but to provide more clarity when we talk about all the types of animals that are in the policy, which include the emotional support animals just by definition and how they're different, service animals, and then service animals of training. But all of those have handlers. There's somebody who is in charge of the animal or is having work done for them by the animal. So that's why we wanted to clarify that and have it fit everybody. So no matter what type of animal somebody has, a handler has on campus, we have I think seven um, or eight responsibilities, but they're all the same. So you have to make sure the animal is under direct control at all times. That could be though by voice, that could be by leash, by harness, by tether. It really depends on how the animal works for the handler. Ensure that the animal is not disruptive to the environments that they're allowed to be in. So that could be the learning environment in classroom settings or living environment in housing settings and a work environment, or just where the members of where the public goes. So making sure that they're under control and not disruptive in those spaces. Your handlers are required to clean up if there's any debris or waste that comes from an animal, which can happen, right? That they're animals. Making sure that they stay out of all the places they're not allowed to go, ponds, streams, fountains, etc., across all of our campus and locations, so not just Seattle, but all locations that the University of Washington has property in. Um, which also goes into there's different cities that we're a part of, right? We're in Bothell, we're in Tacoma, we are in Seattle, we have places up in San Juan Islands, we have property out in Eatonville and Aberdeen, like so we have places all over the state of Washington. So they have to meet whatever those local codes are for cities if there's something specific in that area. And then hopefully this will not happen, but in case there's damage done by the animal, the individual is responsible for that, as well as any costs or care needed to take care of that animal. The university is not obligated to spend any money in those areas.
That's really helpful just to outline these handlers' responsibilities. And great that got clarified as well under state law. I do want to come up on one point of the responsibilities that you said. You were talking about not being disruptive to the learning, living, and working environments. So by you saying that, I'm assuming these animals have access to these three specific environments. Maybe let's walk through one by one of like workplace environments, academic environments, and housing environments, and how access for service animals may be different. Service animals in training may be different in these environments. Would you like to start with workplace?
Sure. So this is a great way this starts to get a little more nuanced. So it's good to talk about each environment specifically. So a workplace environment, it would be where our employees are allowed to go. So that does not necessarily, mean that members of the public or invited business individuals to campus events or spaces could go. So employees have access, and it's solely usually for employees. So in this case, a service animal, it's the one case where it's not always a just general access expectation. As an employee, this does need to go through a request to the Disability Services Office to have it looked at in terms of an accommodation request and to be approved. Part of that process is making sure the workplace environment is going to be um, made supportive for the animal to arrive, as well as cover any safety or health items that need to be addressed by bringing an animal into it. So it does need to go as a request for an accommodation through the Disability Services Office. It's a pretty straightforward process. Service animals are typically that way, but it does need to go that way versus just coming to um, work one day with a service animal.
Great.
The,
So service animals in training, or sorry, service animals that need to have an accommodation to access our workplace environments, especially for any employees who intend to use this. I'm assuming this is the same for our academic environments. Is that right?
No, they don't need to go through an accommodation process. Well, if they have a disability and are working with a disability services office, there's normally accommodations that can get put in place. However, in the case of a service animal, this is a difference of employment. So a service animal that's attached to a student does not need to be an accommodation through the disability office at whichever campus someone is attending. Um, what can be possible if the student would like to do this, the DRS office can provide an access notice to all of their faculty. This could be helpful in the sense that a student doesn't have to tell each faculty all the time what the animal is doing there, that there are a service animal and the tasks that they have to provide. It could be a way to support the student to just tell the DRS office. They can facilitate sharing that information. It's just one less thing the student needs to do and engage with the faculty about. But they don't have to. They can certainly come to class. They will you need to be prepared to answer the questions that are allowable by the faculty, as is any employee on campus, which is this a service animal for a person with a disability? They have to answer that question. And then the follow-up allowed question is what tasks is it performing or able to perform? So those two questions will be asked of students who don't go through the DRS office by faculty or other people in the building.
Okay, so we talked about workplace environments, academic environments, and how that is different. Of you can both go through the accommodation process, but for academic environments, these students are allowed to bring them into buildings and locations where the student with disability is allowed access. What is the access to environment for housing look like our on-campus housing for students or employees?
Housing environment is also similar to the workplace environment because an animal would be living in our communities with us. And we also limit who is in our living communities just with how we set up our housing spaces. So that will need to be a request submitted to housing and DRS because what we'll need to do in that is get verification that the dog has all of its health records up to date. So vaccinations and all the things are sorted. We'll need to make sure that they are in a space that is going to fit for their needs. Um, and other elements that could come up in terms of emergency evacuation and such. So they will need to put housing and DRS on notice that they are bringing or would like to bring in a service animal. So there can be some steps involved to make that happen smoothly and best support that movement process. There could be a time where if they have a roommate they don't know, we may have to make sure that there's no impact in terms of an animal becoming a part of that living community. And if so, we'll just need to sort that out. So that's why we need to have time and a process to vet that in the housing environment.
Great. I'm actually going to throw one more environment in here that I would love some clarity on as well too. What about food establishments on campus? Such as we have Local Point on West Campus at the UW Seattle campus. Are service animals or service animals in training allowed in these food establishments?
Both are allowed in our food establishments, especially when you're just purchasing. You're somebody who is seeking to go to get your sandwich or sit down, right, for a meal. They both statuses of either in training or a service animal, full service animal, are allowed in those spaces. If you're a customer, if you're an employee, that would get vetted through that accommodation process because there are restrictions in terms of food preparation areas and such that would need to assess if that is allowable based off the job functions and tasks that are happening. But any of our on-campus housing at the hub or at Tacoma and Bothell facilities that serve food, there's a like a shop at like a market down at Tacoma and the new eatery down at Bothell. Both are allowed in those as patrons and customers.
Great. So I heard you note that food preparation areas service animals or service animals in training may be restricted for access there. And that's really going to be dependent on either DSO or DRS in the accommodation case or accommodation decision that they make. Is there any other potential restrictions on access that you would really want to engage with one of these designated disability services office to see if you're able for your animal and the handler to be able to access the space?
Yes. Most of these, from an employment perspective, most of the environments you would navigate as an employee should come up in that employee accommodation process regarding the service animal. But from a student perspective, what I'll add to this is traditional classrooms where just tables and chairs. Those are easier just to obviously bring in an animal, as I mentioned before, and not having to go through DRS. However, if you're going to be in a lab class, that could be chemistry to biology, that could be the A&P cadaver lab, that could be when you go out on a clinical setting or in some sort of hospital or clinic setting where you're working with patients as a part of a class structure. There are requirements that we'll have to meet in those types of environments from a healthcare and safety or infection need standards that are out there separate of this process. So in those spaces, those will need to be evaluated potentially. And if an animal is not allowed to be in some of these really critically sensitive lab areas, whether that's biologically sensitive or medically sensitive patient and clinic areas, we would need to find a different alternative to provide access if the animal itself is not allowed to be in it.
Also, close to what you were saying back there, but maybe not exactly of you're just saying not allowed access. But there is the policy by the Washington State Legislature also added on some new requirements from removing animals from universities' facilities. Could you explain to our audience a little bit more about what qualifies for an animal, whether it's a service animal in training, or an emotional support animal to be removed from any of our facilities?
Yeah, and we certainly took some of this from our personal experience that we've had to provide clarity over the years on guidance, in addition to what an animal, according to our state requirements, right, could be removed or evaluated. So know for the listeners that this was a multiple area of need for guidance that we created this removal of animals in university facilities. So the five main ones to highlight here are if an animal is an abandoned and becomes an abandoned animal. Somebody leaves their animal on campus and doesn't come back and get it, then that's a reason we can remove an animal. If for some reason the animal becomes a direct threat, they're attacking individuals once or repeatedly. Again, extremely rare case that this would likely happen. We could remove the animal at that point and assess or give the handler time to assess, like, is there something unique happening right before we let the animal come back on. If an animal's not housebroken, so this means we really can't have very young animals, and since dogs are the primary one we're talking about, animals under 3 months and 6 months, they're still learning a variety of things, including how to go to the bathroom properly and in the right places. So we do require animals to be housebroken in our environments. The last two are out of control animals and then unhygienic animals. So this can come up in these spaces that people live or work, or even in those lab spaces, as I kind of referenced earlier. So if an animal fits any one of these, we have the right under the policy to remove an animal. However, what I will say is we will lead into this and apply this if it's one of these five pieces, but we will also work with that individual to make sure that any accommodation that we could do in the interim to continue to provide access is met. So there will be a interactive process to determine how to best continue access for the individual while that animal is not allowed to be on our premises.
And just for a little bit more clarity on that point that you made at the end too, say a handler's animal was removed during an event. Is that handler allowed to come back to that event without their service animal? And if so, what responsibilities do maybe the folks in the facility or the folks running that event might have to ensure that individual's access?
That's a great example, Toby. So yes, if the animal itself is out of control, somehow either biting or doing things that are providing an unsafe space for people to be around it in an actual event, the animal will need to go under this policy and be removed. But the individual, the handler, can certainly come back to the event. What we'll just need to know is what kind of access needs might they have, right? If the animal is not able to be with them because of their behavior. So there's a yes, along with probably a discussion about what are there things that need to or could be done, right, for the remaining portion of this event to make sure that they have the access.
Bree, in one of your previous questions, I'm not sure if it was the last one or not, you mentioned that university personnel can only ask like the following of service animal handlers. And I think one that you mentioned was whether the service animal is required because of disability, just a yes or no question. And then the second one is what work or task that the animal has been trained to perform, which of course needs some elaboration. Do you have any guidance of what questions or information that university personnel may not request of a handler?
Yes, absolutely. And I will caveat, because I don't know if I did that the previous question. These are things that come from the federal requirements related to the ADA and service animals. So this is not specific to University of Washington or State of Washington, but these are very clear guidelines on when we can ask about a service animal, and then what can't be asked. So just want to put that caveat out there. So to answer your question, Toby, information that should not be asked or requested is information about the nature of the individual's disability. The question is simply, is this animal for a person with a disability? What also cannot be requested is any medical information or documentation either about the disability or the medical condition or the animal itself in terms of training. You can't then that goes into you can't ask for documentation or proof that the animal is a service animal. There are groups that train dogs for individuals with a vision loss or a vision disability, like Guide Dogs of America, for example. But we do not ask for documentation because there's many ways that animals can be trained, and individuals can train animals to perform tasks for them directly. You also can't ask for a demonstration of the tasks that the animal is trained to perform, because many of the tasks happen perhaps in an episode that might be occurring for somebody with a disability. Like panic attack example that I raised. We're not going to have somebody do a panic attack just to show a task, for example, right? So you cannot ask. Let me just summarize. You cannot ask for information about the individual disabilities. You cannot ask for medical information or documentation about the disability, the person, or the animal, and you can't ask for summary or a demonstration of the tasks that they perform.
Great, thank you. And I know in some cases there is doubt that university personnel may have whether an animal is a service animal. And typically in these cases, it's folks with maybe a non-apparent disability, or what some call an invisible disability. So say that university personnel asked the two questions. They said, yes, the service animal is because of a disability, and they are assigned to perform X, Y, and Z. If that university personnel still has doubt, are they allowed to restrict them from entering a space or entering a certain event? How does that happen?
Yeah, this has happened before, so I'll acknowledge that. So unless there is an issue that comes up that would rise to the level of either the handler not meeting their responsibilities, so like there's damage, or the animal's going in places they're not supposed to, or they're not under the handler's control, that would be a reason to have that conversation and potentially escort the individual out of the environment. Or if there is they're not if it's clear that they're not performing a task. Like there has to be actual evidence to show or actual examples versus versus no examples in those cases. So if the person comes in, answers the questions, gives direct tasks that they are describing are performed, right? Like they're here to guide me through a room. They're here to support from a what was my example earlier? Be a support, like to lead on them or something to that effect. Those are things that we let them in and participate, and include them in all the activities until something changes in the information that we have.
Great. So if those two questions are answered, if they are meeting all the handler's responsibilities and they are not meeting one of the reasons for a removal of an animal, that animal should be permitted.
Correct.
Great. And I know if there's any questions about future access, they could always contact the ADA coordinator as well too, or the ADA office for further clarification or further guidance, depending on the situation.
Yes. I will say that overall, we rarely have any challenges with service animals on campus. Um, that's that's the great news to share. Like we have a great inclusive campus, and this is not a common topic, but I know it is a question that comes up. So in the rare cases this might arise, please reach out and let's chat about it.
Yeah, it's a great point. Just want to make sure that handlers know their rights and what is expected of university personnel. So it's great that the policy outlines this. Well, as you are the designated ADA coordinator for the University of Washington and kind of the pinpoint person for any questions regarding service animals, I'd like to ask from, say, maybe an employee perspective or a faculty who is engaging with an individual who has a service animal, and maybe they have questions. When would you refer them to come to the ADA office to ask some clarifying questions?
There's probably three main areas that I'll state here. I'm sure there's more, but the first one is if there's any clarification that any member, student, faculty, staff, or somebody coming to our events in athletics or other places, if they have any clarifications about the policy or the guidance outline that they need more information on to fully understand it, please reach out. That's definitely number one. I want to make sure that the information is clear and informative. If you are an event coordinator, would be number two. So in that example mentioned earlier, if you are hosting an event, either one time or a series, and you have questions about because if people are talking about they want to bring their animal and you want to walk through a scenario, that's definitely one to bring and raise, and happy to do that proactively as you are thinking about your event. If you are a building coordinator, very similar. So people who are in charge of our buildings across all of our locations, sometimes there might be questions about spaces you have, and you want to consult on the different kinds of spaces and how that applies in very unique variables. So also a good place to consult. So whether you're an event coordinator or a building coordinator, those could be additional points of clarification. If you're an individual with a disability or a handler of an animal and you want to know some more information, about where you're going to go and things to be aware of, or a little more information about how to request something or understand a process, please reach out there. That's also something that we can do and talk about it, a little more individualized information on access for on a case-by-case basis. Well, actually, the
Great.
last one I'll add, I know I said three, but I'll add a fourth, which is if there's ever a time that animals are going to be removed or not allowed. So that could be like one of our environments, right? We can't let an animal into an environment. It's determined to not be able to go into an environment, or an animal happens to get removed. Those are definitely times to reach out to the ADA office, both if you're the event person or the person in charge of the building, or the individual who was told the animal is not allowed or has to leave. So the office of the ADA coordinator is the place to bring that to, and we can help facilitate next steps or answers to those questions.
I think that is all the questions I have for you today. Do you have any last comments that you would like to make about the updates to the service animal policy before we close out?
Nothing that I think I covered all of it, but we certainly encourage people to go check out the website. Toby made a great slide deck that you can share with any members of your unit or community just to learn more. And just again, if you have any lingering questions, so please reach out to our office and we will be of assistance.
Great. Thank you so much, Bree. And as Bree mentioned, below this podcast, if you're on the ADA office website, which is washington.edu /ADA, you will be able to learn much more about the policy. We have a resource on our website that goes over the policy, as well as we'll be linking to the UW policy as a whole. So feel free to refer to these information and materials to familiarize yourself on the rights and responsibilities. As well as Bree mentioned, if you have any questions or concerns, do not hesitate to reach out to the ADA office. But thank you again, Bree, for this conversation.
Thank you, Toby.